Hello, and welcome to New England Authors. We present some of the best talent in the region, and every week we have a different author. Our author today is Jeannette de Beauvoir. Welcome to the show, Jeanette. You write about Cape Cod. This is where we're going today. We're going down to the Cape, and particularly Provincetown. And what comes across in your writing is that you have a great love of the place, don't you?
I do. I love Provincetown. I love its people. I love its history. And of course, since I'm doing a murder mystery series, I'm killing them all slowly off.
Yeah, but killing off the people.
That's how I'm being nice to them.
But you describe Cape Cod, and particularly Provincetown, as something that's different. I think you used the word bubble. It's different from the rest of New England. Could you talk about that a bit?
In some ways it is. Provincetown has traditionally been a place that really attracted eccentric kinds of people from the beginning. Artists, there was that great summer of 1916 where all the artists who normally would go to Paris came here instead because they could, because of the war. And since then, it's become also a sort of mecca for gay people. It was one of the first places where they could feel accepted. So it really has attracted the kind of people who do end up somewhere where you don't end up there by accident.
But you also describe Provincetown as different from the rest of the Cape. And your story, the Killer Carnival, takes place in Provincetown, right? At the beginning of the book, your protagonist, who lives in Provincetown, goes to the next town over, or a couple of towns over, Orleans, to have her tarot cards read or something like that. And it's a very different world than Provincetown, right?
It is a very different world. It does feel like there's this divide that you cross when you come. There's a hill in Truro that when you get to the top of the hill, you look down, you see the whole harbor, and you see the Pilgrim Monument, and you see the whole town spread out there. And there is a sense of passing into something a little bit different.
Yeah.
Even the weather can be a little bit different there from in Truro or Wellfleet.
So the Pilgrims of the Mayflower landed there, and they apparently saw the rock from across the bay, which is now a little stone. I don't know how they saw it, but they did. But I guess it was a rock at one time.
Well, they planned to stay in Provincetown, but there was no drinkable water there. And but they did stay in Provincetown Harbor, and that's where they signed the Mayflower Compact. And then found that the winter was very difficult. There was a lot to eat. There was no water, and they ended up going up to Plymouth. And there continues the story.
There continues the story, yeah. So the Cape itself, it's been changing over the years, right? Someone described it to me as a place turning into a retirement community. Is that what your sense is? What's going on there? What's going on there?
I think that is partially correct. It's mostly because of rising real estate costs, so that young people are finding it more and more difficult to live there. There's a huge problem with having people who are coming in the summer to work in the restaurants and work in all the service industries and not having affordable housing for them. So I think that that's one of the reasons that they say there's a graying of the Cape.
I see, I see. Can you please tell us a little about your background? I gleaned from your writing that you grew up Catholic, and I got that idea because your protagonist grew up Catholic, and I assume you did too. Is that right?
I did, yes, absolutely. I grew up in France. My father was French and my mother was American, which is why I can speak English without an accent. And yeah, I grew up going to a convent school. And for a very long time, it was very important to me. I wanted to give my protagonist a familiar background, but I think she's a lot more of an incisive thinker about it than I am. She's much more lapsed than I am.
Yeah.
And that gives me the opportunity to really give her a chance to. And she's got a boyfriend who's Muslim, so there's going to be some some interesting conversations there for sure.
That's important that he's Muslim. You've written a lot of good books, bestsellers on other subjects. This one is your latest book, and it takes place during Carnival week.
It does. So what the plan is, has been, and continues to be, is to feature each book is during one of the theme weeks of Provincetown.
One of the what weeks?
Theme weeks.
Theme weeks.
So Provincetown has a bunch of theme weeks, including Carnival being one of them. But my goal in the series was actually, there are so many, as I said, strange and eccentric and different people who come to Provincetown. And they're the kind of people, I think, in general, that many folks think of as the other. They're different. They're gay. There's a whole bunch of gay men who are big, hairy gay men who love other big, hairy gay men. They're called bears. I don't think that a lot of people know about that. So I thought, all right, if I situate these mysteries in these different, giving them these different contexts, it will enable people to read them and then say, oh yeah, okay, I get it, sort of. So I've done Fantasia Fair, which is a transgender event. I've done Bear Week, which is the gentleman I was just talking about. I did the Portuguese Festival. Now I have Carnival, and I have a holiday one coming up for our FOLLY.
Interesting. A whole series of festivals. Do they all feature Sydney, the protagonist?
Yes, yes. Sydney's the through line for all of them.
Yeah, so tell us about her. She works in a wedding planner. Tell us a little about her.
So I wanted to give her a job that would have some flexibility so that she's got some time to go out and solve some of these mysteries that arise. And wedding industry is pretty significant in the summertime in Provincetown, mostly gay weddings, because we were, of course, one of the first places that gay people could get married. And there remains this sort of...
Well, I'll have to correct you there. Actually, Cambridge, Massachusetts was the first place at midnight.
I do stand corrected, yes,
okay.
Absolutely. I think I kind of meant Massachusetts, but Provincetown is the sort of destination wedding place for a lot of people. They tend to be very casual weddings because we're a very casual city or town. But so I knew about all these weddings going on. So I thought, all right, I'll make her a wedding planner. I did invent the inn where she works because I'm killing off a whole lot of people there, and I didn't want any of the real inns in town to take umbrage at that. But what I do have is I have a lot of real people who feature in all of the books. Some of the places, like a pizza place she goes to, is a real place. And I think that's kind of fun because not only do people who live there say, oh yeah, you really captured it, but I have people who come to visit who say, oh my gosh, that's the restaurant that Sydney ate at.
Yeah, so you described the scene there during summer, especially the week of Carnival, as very busy. What do the people who live there year-round, what do they feel about this kind of crowd? People coming in like we did on the ferry, driving in. You describe it as a blessing and a curse.
It's definitely a love-hate relationship. The nice thing about Provincetown, about living there year-round, is that in essence, I live in two different places. In the wintertime, it's quiet, it's desolate. We go down to under 2,000 inhabitants.
Wow.
So we kind of know each other, everybody knows each other, and it's a chance to really do some kind of community things. But it also does get cold and lonely and all those things, so that by springtime, you're sort of ready for them to start coming back, and of course for places to open again, because almost everything shuts down. So the restaurants start opening again, the shops start opening again, people start coming, and then by August you really want them all to go home.
I see, I see.
Please.
Yes, I know. This is New England Authors. We're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our author today is Jeannette de Beauvoir. So, as you mentioned, your protagonist's boyfriend happens to be from Beirut, which is where I'm from. And you had a few things to say about Beirut, about Lebanon. And I completely agree with what you said. Can you tell us what you said about Lebanon?
Right. So, yeah, I had a number of people in my life when I lived in France who were from Beirut. And the stories that they told of the kind of lifestyle that it had, it was like the second Paris. It was the Paris of the Mediterranean.
Yes.
And then that changed, and a lot of people found that very difficult. There was a real shift with this sort of Arab culture and what was perceived as the European culture, and they did not mix well. And of course, then there was Civil War. So
yeah.
it's a story that has a lot of, I think, deep emotional connections for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I assume for you.
Yeah, you know, even during the wars, there was still a kind of niceness among people. I don't know how to describe it. It's people think that there was a Christian-Muslim divide, but it really wasn't like that at all. So anyway, Ali, to get back to your book, Ali, the boyfriend, actually works for ICE.
He does.
Tell us a little about that.
So in the first book in the series, I did not plan on giving her a boyfriend, at least right away. And the first book is posited on the possibility that the innkeeper, the place where she works, is doing fake marriages to give people green cards.
Yeah.
It turns out that was not true, but he came to investigate it. And they had such an immediate friction as I was writing it that I was thinking, they're going to end up together.
Yes.
And so he was at that time investigating things. He then, because I probably couldn't deal with somebody who worked in that department of ICE, he did transfer into human trafficking.
Yeah.
So he's one of the good guys now.
He has a very interesting sister. Her name is Karen, and she's actually in this book, in the Killer Carnival. She really doesn't appear very often, very little. She's talked about a lot more than she appears, and happens to be the Boston Police Commissioner and a devout Muslim. She wears the hijab. Tell us.
So I have several people floating through this series that I always feel like, well, at some point I'm going to make more of them in the story, but not quite yet. And Karen is someone who totally intimidates Sidney, my protagonist.
Yeah.
First of all, it's the boyfriend's sister, so you want to make a good impression, but she's also a police commissioner, so she's a person of some stature, and she like Ali, had not been particularly practicing, but did go back to Lebanon for some time and ended up becoming more devout.
Yeah.
And Ali's not entirely comfortable with that. Sidney's not, but Sidney's terrified of her. So that's why we talk about her a lot. And then hopefully in this one and in the next one, she and Sidney are starting to become closer.
Now, they come down to the Cape purportedly to see Sidney and to have a little vacation, but it isn't like that, right?
I tend to not be able to divorce my writing from the rest of my world. If there's something on my mind, I tend to work it out for myself by writing about it.
Exactly, and which is a very good strategy for anybody to write about.
It makes for some interesting books, doesn't it? So I've been, obviously, with a lot of other people, thinking a lot about white supremacists lately and about the sort of movement toward fascism in some way that is an undercurrent of our culture right now. And so I thought, what would happen if something came to Provincetown? Because there have been threats, mostly not so much because of any religious issues, but because of it being such a place for gay people and for transgender people to feel comfortable. And there are a lot of people who don't feel comfortable with them feeling comfortable, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So I thought, okay, I'm going to bring these people here who can actually deal with something that might be very important, and I don't want to give too much away here, but and then integrate them into what's going on with Carnival, which is the most joyous, fabulous, over-the-top celebration.
Yeah, there are floats and things like that. I can imagine from what your description of your book was over the top.
It is insane. It is summers can be insane there, and the absolute pinnacle of insanity is Carnival Week.
So here we have the Boston Police Commissioner who happens to be there, and then a bomb goes off on one of the floats. I'm sorry, am I giving away anything here?
I think we say that like in the first paragraph, so we're okay.
Oh, no, right. And some bad things happen and so on. What else is going on there at the time?
Well, I always like to have little subplots going, and I'll be honest with you, most of the time I introduce a subplot and then forget about it and have to go back and sort of do whack-a-mole with plot holes because, oh yeah, I was going to do something with that, and then I forgot, or another one will take off. So I've got a couple of subplots in here. One is with Mirela, who is Sydney's closest friend. She's Bulgarian, which is also sort of a very Provincetown kind of thing. We have a lot of Bulgarian young people who come in the summer.
Is that right?
Oh, huge, huge number.
I wonder why. Well,
it's like one of those things that, like, I think one or two came, and then they told everyone about it, and it's just become this sort of Bulgarian, I won't want to say empire, but you know, even some of the businesses now are owned by these 20-something kids who come and they work so hard, which is obviously welcomed by the businesses in town. I know that the owner of the Lobster Pot said, you know, I hire an American kid and their first question is, when do I get time off? And I hire a Bulgarian kid and their question is, how many more hours can I work? So Mirela came as one of these kids and ended up, because it's such an art colony, finding a niche for herself as a visual artist there. So it's good because I've got all these different people from, which is also true of the town, people from way different cultures and different backgrounds who come, and there's an opportunity to, I hope not explain too much, but at least show the reader a little bit, a glimpse, as they explain to each other what's going on in their cultures. It gives the reader a glimpse of that as well.
If you're just joining us, this is New England Authors. We're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we're talking about Cape Cod, and we're talking about this book, The Killer Carnival. And I want to bring something up in your book that I found very interesting because it kind of ties in with our show. And it seems to me our show is about tolerance and expanding our horizon. And it seems to me that your book is the same. In the very beginning, your protagonist goes to this smaller town on the Cape, and she encounters a couple of roughnecks who are badgering this 13-year-old girl who's wearing the headscarf. And I think you're preaching tolerance. I don't mean preaching, I meant advocating. Is that what you want your readers to walk away with?
Yeah.
Is that one of your themes?
That's absolutely my theme, and my goal is to open up these worlds to other people so that they don't feel like this is foreign to me, this is someone who is lesser than I am, or fear people because they're different. Yeah. So yeah, my goal throughout it is to sort of point out the ridiculousness of behavior like those two guys in the shop. Yeah. But also the fear of the young girl who didn't know how to respond to them. Yeah. And the concern that my protagonist shared that, you know, we're not always used to seeing this, and how do you respond when you see something like that? And do you do something about it? Do you intervene, or do you sit there and feel awkward?
So I'm wondering now, if we did have a police commissioner in a big city like Boston who wore the headscarf and was a devout Muslim, how do you think that person, a woman too, how do you think that person would be looked upon by the rest of the community?
Oh, well, I guess it depends on the community. I think that she would have, and I think I point this out, a really tough time within the police department because already there's a culture there of sort of hazing as people move up through the ranks. There's also traditionally been a culture of it being male, and certainly there's not been a culture of it being Muslim. So I did give her a whole lot of obstacles there. But I had been reading not too long before I started this an article, and it was not Boston, it was another city, but it was a police force that was actually designing some headscarves for the women officers who were Muslim, so that it would still look like the uniform, it'd still be appropriate.
I see. Interesting.
So there are people out there doing it. I think it's challenging, and you know, God bless them.
I have to say that in many cities in New England, I can't speak for outside New England, but in many cities in New England, I found that the police commissioners are very enlightened. They're African-American, white, I don't know if there are any Muslims, but people who really want to change the way things are, who want to better their community. Can Can you summarize The Killer Carnival? Because I want to move on to some of your other very interesting books.
All right, so The Killer Carnival takes place obviously during Carnival Week, and the inn at which Sydney works has a float in the parade, and all of the floats are down at the Harbor Hotel, which is actually where they do get ready, and hers blows up. And she is pretty convinced that someone wants to kill her, and goes through a lot of thoughts around that, because it's not a typical feeling for us to have. And eventually, as you mentioned, Ali and Karen have come down to be with her, and by one means or another, and I don't want to get into too many details, they find out that there is indeed a plot that was originally centered around some Muslims, but actually became centered around a lot of the gay population in Provincetown, and an attempt to do something extremely destructive. She teams up with a doctor, her doctor, who's an African-American, and so I really am hitting all the diversity chimes here. And together they, along with Ali, who actually ends up getting arrested, but that's another story, end up getting through and getting the town through, and hopefully getting everybody a little bit wiser.
Good, yeah. It's a very readable book. I want to talk about another one of your books because it's one of my favorite subjects. It goes back into history, the history of the Middle Ages, right here next to me. It's called Lethal Alliances. Can you tell us a little about it?
Sure. So Lethal Alliances is a book that I actually started writing when I was 15. It has gone through a lot of revisions since then, but what is amazing about it, and one of the reasons I like to write historical fiction as well as mystery fiction, is you don't have to make this stuff up. It is amazing if you look into history, the things that happen. And in fact, someone who read this recently said that it gave him a sort of tingle up his spine because it felt so relevant to today. So essentially what's happened is we're at the court of Philip IV of France, and he is in
this real, is in the 1300s.
Right, around 13. So I think we open around 1305. He is in battle with the Pope, and the Pope wants to be in charge, and the King wants to be in charge, and the King really does a better job of it, probably murdered the Pope, had him murdered, is responsible for the papacy moving to Avignon. But also, it's the beginning of the sort of seeds of the 100 Years' War that really happened then. He had all sorts of wars he was fighting all the time, and he needed money for it, so he borrowed from the Jews until he couldn't pay them back, so he expelled them all from France. Then he borrowed from the Templars, the military Christian order, and when he couldn't borrow any more money from them, he burned them at the stake. He was not a man who was particularly nice to know. But I will tell you, there's one character in there that I made up out of whole cloth, and that is it. Everybody else, obviously I made up conversations and thoughts and all those things, but other than that, everybody in there really lived.
Really interesting, interesting. I'm looking forward to reading it. Tell us about another one of the books you wrote. You can't go through all your books, but a couple of representative ones. Tell us about Deadly Jewels.
So Deadly Jewels is the second in a series that takes place in Montreal, which is one of my favorite cities. And again, it sort of actually marries these two because it's a modern day murder mystery, but the solution to it and the antecedents to it all took place in the past. In this case, it's kind of ironic, funny, I don't know. I was looking into Montreal's history, and I was finding, as I was doing research, these rumors about the British crown jewels were stored in Montreal during the Second World War for safekeeping.
Is that right? Yeah.
Well, that was a rumor, sort of, and I was like,
uh-huh.
okay, but I'll be interested in maybe putting that in the book. Let me find out more. And I was in Montreal, as I go there a few times a year, and I was there on a Saturday. I thought, you know, I've never taken the bus tour. Maybe I'll take the bus tour of Montreal. So I get on the bus, and we're starting to go, and the guide goes up and says, so the building behind us, that's where they stored the crown jewels during the Second World War. I'm thinking, so much for it being a rumor.
Yes. Is it true? A lot of what people say on those tours, I mean, they tell good stories. They embellish the truth a little too much.
I think it's pretty true that it was. I'm pretty sure of that. And then the one that precedes this, called Asylum, is interesting right now in that Stephen Kinzer just came out with his new book, Poisoner in Chief, which is about the CIA's MK-Ultra program. And my book that precedes this, Asylum, also touches on that MK-Ultra program.
What was that? What was that program?
The MK-Ultra program was CIA's attempt at mind control. So they did all sorts of experiments on people who were vulnerable populations and were not able to speak up for themselves.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like the Facebook of back then, right?
Well, yeah, it was a pretty scary program, and it's interesting because not many people know about it, even though there's a Wikipedia entry for it. But I was pleased that Stephen Kinzer started writing about it.
Before. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, you're coming out with a couple of more books in the Provincetown series, right?
Absolutely. We're committed to the series. So we have one coming out in November, and unfortunately my publisher will not tell me what it's called yet. They have their own ideas about it. Yeah, they're still working on that. So it will be for FOLLY, which is another theme week. And then in the spring, there's one at the film festival, the International Film Festival in Provincetown. So that's what we are looking forward to in the near future, but we've got a lot of theme weeks. I've got several years worth of work here. Okay,
Jeanette, it was really wonderful to talk to you. We talked about Cape Cod, we talked about Provincetown, we talked about your writing. I'm looking forward to reading this book about the Middle Ages, one of my favorite periods. This is New England Authors. We're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You could catch any episodes you missed on YouTube. And we record here, but broadcast on all the stations around New England. And remember, watch locally.